this kid to then being told while his family was out eating that a guy's like, oh my god, I remember watching you as a kid. So it's kind of came full circle that way for him. And then Bruno, I mean, he's in his 80s. I mean, he looks great for being in his 80s. And Ric Flair for his 60s looks like shit, unfortunately for him. But that's another story for another time. Or I'll get into that a little bit later. Let's see. Then they go to the next segment where Bruno and Flair start talking. And they're kind of comparing each other, like how they were, well, Bruno first said that he met Flair in Chicago. They talk about who they were working that night and who he was teaming with. And then Flair was saying at that time he was about 300 pounds, which I believe when he retired, he was billed at about 250 or something. 240, 250, something like that. But the heaviest he was 315. And Bruno was talking about how, because then Orton brings up, oh, well, don't you have like a bench press record? And he said he bench pressed 565, basically stating, oh, well, back in my day, I love this with old timers, back in my day, we didn't have the fancy technologies you guys have with the wraps on your hands and the elbows, and in competition you did it differently then. I think it was, or what did he say? Once you had the weights on your chest, the judge had to go 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, clap his hands, you had to lift it up from there. So, very, very different, obviously, now versus then. So that was 565, and then Bruno was talking about how he came to the country and whatever. He was 84 pounds at 14 years old, and 9 years later he winds up bulking up to 275, and people were thinking he was on chemicals, or sorry, if it were this day and age, everyone would have been thinking that he was like using steroids. So then they're talking about aging between the three of them, like how the years have passed, and then they're talking about Orton eating anything that he wants when he first kind of came in, and then Flair's talking about he got injured, he was out for 9 months and put on a little bit of weight, his metabolism was slowing down, so they're kind of laughing and poking fun at each other and talking about how they're all getting old, and yet Orton's not even 40, so we'll leave that out of the way. But again, as I had pointed out before, Bruno's aged a little more gracefully, as Flair at the time is really, and his old habits and tragedies in his family kind of really took a toll on him. But, I mean, still sharp as a tack. I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic what he still remembers from back in his days wrestling. And same thing with Bruno. I mean, God, the guy's 82, 84? I don't know. In the next segment, they're talking about war stories of Bruno's. If, he came in the country in 1950 after leaving Nazi-occupied Europe, and talking about how like his mom's mountain trips to get supplies was a 24-hour trip. There was one time she was shot. She had to break into her own house because everything else was Nazi-occupied, and scary stuff. Scary stuff for living through that time. And Bruno was born in 1935, so I mean, obviously he saw the whole thing being there. So many years later, we're grateful that he lived, and because then we're talking about Bruno had like some sort of fever cured by leeches. His mom had put leeches on him. The theory was leeches took out the poison, whatever it would be, in your blood, and you're basically cured. So they're talking about that. Then they're talking about Bruno's first gym experiences, being brought to the Jewish Y, but by a friend, and he started seeing weights, and kind of changed his life. And thank goodness for that friend, because then people like my mother, who Bruno was her favorite, she wouldn't have experienced Bruno Sammartino, and I wouldn't have heard the stories of Bruno Sammartino and of the like, and wrestling history wouldn't be what it is today. Who knows? Maybe somebody else Koloff or Pedro Morales or whomever it would have been would have held the title for 5,000 days or whatever it would be between both reigns. So, it's amazing how you listen to stories like that, and if things were different, just in the slightest, how the course of wrestling history would have changed, and who knows if there would have been guys like Hogan and guys like Warrior, and later on Hart, Austin, Rock, other guys like Michaels, and Rock and Roll Express, anybody, God, how things would have been very different. They would have been very, very different. Then you get into a conversation that I find very interesting, because Ric Flair was talking about being the champion back in the day. And all within this time, they're talking about anywhere between. Well, Ric Flair made a comment, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I'm not sure if I got the exact quote right. I hope guys now appreciate it now like I did. Probably meaning, well, and then he brings up Orton as an example. When Orton won his first one, which was back in, 2004, against, before mentioned, Chris Benoit. He, the story was that he went out and bought a Rolex. And basically, learning from Ric Flair, being the champion, he kind of had to look the part too. So he definitely tried and went out and got himself a Rolex. Couldn't wait to show Flair. But and then they're saying that champions don't really do that now, which I get. Like, okay, I can go back to a Paul Bearer interview that he did, and he was talking about how when Slaughter was champion, Sergeant Slaughter, he, as the champion, because a lot of times back in the day, promoters would sometimes, like what Vince did for Slaughter, he gave him a limo to ride around in to look the part of a champion, of being the champion. And Paul Bearer got a ride in a limo, like, hey, you want to ride? Oh, yeah, that's great. Wow, isn't this cool? I'm riding with the world's champion. Times have changed. I mean, now you have champions in both brands. Obviously, the WWE champion belonging to SmackDown Live, and the Universal Champion belonging to Raw, barely, since Brock's never there. And I don't look at people that way anymore like I used to. As much as I would like to see certain people holding the title, we saw Bray Wyatt as champion for a little bit. Jinder Mahal is now the champion, and I don't care what anybody says. I'll say this once. I said this 1,000 times. He looks the part of a champion. He looks the part of a champion. He comes out during the promos in a suit, and a nice tailored suit. Come out, does his promo. I don't know how he rides. I don't know if Vince is going the extra yard and extra mile and giving him the limos. Like the before mentioned story, or I don't know any of that. All I remember, and I can tell you, I almost got ran over by, oh God, who the hell was it? Mason Ryan, and two other guys. I think it was Mason Ryan, Del Rio, and one other person. Leaving a Survivor Series one time, or the Rumble, I can't remember, but it was an event, and Ricardo Rodriguez. So I almost got hit by a car by those three. And it was a white sedan, nothing spectacular, just kind of, to get around in. All right, that's great. But I don't see that being the way that a world champion rides around now, meaning a nice car. Cena, you look at like his house, whether it be on Total Bellas, Total Divas, Auto Geek, he's got a nice house. Like, he's made a lot of money wrestling. And now he's making more money doing television and all those other appearances, movies, everything. He lives the life of a champion, and he got treated as such. Okay, but that's a guy who's above and beyond everybody else. And that's no disrespect, but that's just the truth. Certain guys get treated differently, and I get it. I'm sure Orton has outrageous accommodations for his contract. I know Big Show has his own bus, and it's crazy, but I don't get the sense, and Flair might be onto something, and Orton didn't really deny it either, and if he did, I didn't hear it. Nobody ever really treats it that way anymore, and it's a shame because nobody carries themselves like the way they used to. It's just a different way of things. And another comment that I remember hearing from people, a lot of guys on the indies or a lot of guys in the locker room, I forget who I heard the comments from. Oh God, who the hell was it? Brian Kendrick. And he had said something about the likes of people are less concerned about what their peers are thinking of them, meaning like the agents and this, that. Like nobody's asking the agents any questions anymore. After their match, they'll go to the internet and see what the fans thought on Twitter. Like, it's very, very different the way things are in wrestling now. So, then they get into, and I digress, my apologies. Then they get into the short title reigns now versus the reigns then of a million days. And we'll get into that in a little bit later. But then, then Bruno's talking about, like, he was hired by Vince McMahon, he would be working 6 days a week, and then he got contracted out in Toronto for 2 days. Talking about boxing rings, you got the crap beat out of you when you work in those rings. And then Flair was like, oh yeah, I worked 7 days a week, twice on Saturday, twice on Sunday. You do double shots. That was just the way, I guess, the champion worked then. And then they were talking, and then Bruno talked about the Koloff title change. This is a little bit of wrestling, other than, the scheduling and the like, than what you were talking about. And Bruno believes that Koloff should have gotten more than the short reign he was given, which, about 3 weeks later, he loses the title to Pedro Morales. And Bruno's like, oh, no disrespect to Pedro Morales, but I wish Koloff had gotten his due, which I can see. And again, obviously, I wasn't born in that time. I don't know, and probably history again would be changed if it wasn't booked as such. But and then he was talking about how it was easier for the bad guys to go over on TV and this, that. So I don't know, just the way the dynamics were back in the day. Kind of changed the fate for Koloff and then eventually Pedro Morales. So, then we get into title reigns, kind of what I was talking about a little bit before. Orton asks the question to Flair, so how many days, were you champion combined? Probably thinking the 16, not the 21 that Flair had kind of talked about before. And Flair was saying 3,800 days plus. And then he mentioned how it's so different now versus then. Again, my prior comment. Now versus then, John Cena, when he tied Ric Flair's record, official record, not unofficial, is Cena's only held the title for like 1,500 days. And they're talking about how the title flip-flops now, and this is Orton saying it too, where he's part to blame with it too. He goes along with it. And, he kind of has to. But there was one summer where it was him, John Cena, Triple H back and forth, or spring into summer. It was crazy. To the point where the USA Network, I remember reading, had to say, dude, just chill. You have no one to build on as the face of the company if you keep flip-flopping a title like this. Like, holy shit. So, pardon me. So then, Bruno was talking about over 4,800 days or 5,000 days as champion. About like 4,800 days. And again, different time. And, that was Bruno with 2 title reigns versus Ric Flair's 16. So, it was still changing, but you still had over 3,000 days versus 1,500 days. With, so yeah, here we go. Ric Flair versus Dusty Rhodes was when he basically saying it's when he got his first title win. Dusty put him over. Ric Flair was at about 31. And then he's talking about being ready. Saying like, alright, I'm used to working guys like Steamboat and this, that. And, and then you're also working a bunch of guys who couldn't work